Allison said I would upset people.
Hey, everybody's got to have a camera.
That's right. Well, hello everyone. This is not bad for July 3rd. Thank you for being here. We're about half strength, but that's pretty good with that. If you've not met Aaron and Manjeet, please meet them after class today. And I think everyone else has been here before. So they were asking Charlene what kind of format we had for the class, and I said it's chaos. We just do whatever. We just do whatever. So we're going to do prayer concerns. I'm starting to do prayer concerns at the end of the lesson when we end the live stream. So just be aware of that. We're going to start doing the lesson up front. And I know that there are a number of prayer concerns we want to be attended to today. I do, though, want to read to you this note from Kristen, if that's all right. Thank you all for being a part of making the reception after my dad's memorial service incredibly special. Not only was I blessed to visit with so many people from different stretches of my dad's and my family's lives, I could tell by the buzz of the room that everyone was enjoying sharing memories. Of course, they were enjoying all the food as well. I also appreciate all the notes and words of encouragement many of you have sent me as well over the past week. I feel blessed to have the support of so many Wilshire friends at this time. I love this place. Thank you, Kristen. It was a lovely service. Really loved the service on Wednesday, and several of you were there. Remarkable life. Absolutely remarkable life. Somehow I had missed the fact that he'd worked for Henry Wade all those years.
Well, actually Henry Wade was where he started, but then he moved to the U.S. Attorney's Office,
so it really wasn't as long.
Right, a short term with Henry Wade, and then.
Okay.
But several of there were like the current U.S. Attorney and at least two of the past ones. He hadn't worked for the current one, obviously, because it's been a long time. But the two of the past ones, including the one that he was hired under, were all there. So that was really cool. They had seen the article in the paper, not the obituary, but the article that was that day, or the day before. That worked out really nicely.
Fascinating. Great. Okay. Well, we'll talk about this at the end again, but just also make everyone aware that also on Wednesday, George Mason Sr. passed, if you didn't know that, and that service will be July 13th, a week from Wednesday, at 1:30 in the afternoon here at Wilshire. More details to come.
Is that a Wednesday or?
It's a Wednesday.
Tuesday. It is, okay, I thought the 13th was what I
It is.
Isn't that a Wednesday?
It is a Wednesday. This Wednesday's the 6th. Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
right, okay, you're right.
Well, the new math, I don't know. Maybe it's coming more.
No, I have my days mixed up, okay.
Mark, brunch next week?
Next week is brunch. Thank you. Thank you. Without Doug and Mary Ann here to remind me of important things. Yes. And also, that reminds me that we need to get our heads together. John, Eric, and Shannon are expecting in the late summer, early fall. And we need to talk about what we as a class want to do there.
Do we need to send a thing around and sign up for who's going to bring?
Bring whatever you want.
Yeah.
Well, we're until we get further organized with that, Mary Ann.
Yeah, we're going back to our
We're back to free will.
Okay, okay.
Free will. No predestination.
Free will.
Donna?
Did we have enough money to cover
We did.
for last time?
We found the class fund.
Okay, are we doing that again every so often, or
We will.
what do we do?
Yeah, I need to find out. We had quite a bit in the class fund
Okay.
earlier. Yeah, so. And speaking of, I would remind you that we're coming up very soon on the anniversary of Teresa's death. And that's just been 1 year. Hard to believe. Yeah.
Those anniversaries are
Yes, and you know about that.
yes, I did.
Yeah.
It was in August.
Was it the end of July or was it in August?
August. You talking about Teresa?
Yeah.
Tried in August.
Okay. Well, So we're journeying through 1 Peter, and last week we had to shut it off because we didn't get as far as I hoped we'd get on it. Well, if I can get to the right place here. We're in chapter 2, beginning at verse 4. Would someone be willing to read for us verses 4 through 8? Chapter 2, verses 4 through 8. Someone?
Say it again, what you want.
Chapter 2, verses 4 through 8. You got it?
And coming to him as to a living stone rejected by men, but choice and precious in the sight of God. You also as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For this is contained in Scripture. Behold, I lay in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone, and he who believes in him shall not be disappointed. This precious value then is for you who believe. But for those who disbelieve, the stone which the builders rejected, this became the very cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. For they stumble because they are disobedient to the word, and to this doom they are also appointed.
Okay, a lot to unpack here. So remember that just prior to this, we were talking about purifying your souls and being rid of all malice, and how the Word of God endures forever. The flesh is like grass and it fades away, but the Word of God endures. And therefore, rid yourselves of all these bad things and bad behaviors, and crave the pure spiritual milk of the Word to grow into salvation, and taste and see that the Lord is good. And so what we're at today follows directly on that, but we switch images here. So we've gone from agricultural images that we've been having now to a construction image, and particularly the image of building something of stone. Now, I have never built, well, I made an interlocking retaining wall with stones that are all the same size. That was hard work. But you didn't have to have any decision making. Have any of you ever built anything out of different size stones? Yeah? So what's involved in that?
Well, you have to be, you have to have a good eye, and you have to be very careful. Well, you kind of move slowly, and the mortar has to be just so, or it either won't work or will work too well.
Okay.
But it's always very pretty because the stones are pretty.
All right. So in construction, particularly in buildings that are made of stone, you typically have a cornerstone. Now we tend to think of cornerstones as a decorative piece, right? A decorative piece that maybe put a time capsule in. And the stone that we're talking about here is actually the stone that holds things together. You might also call it, in some language, you call it a keystone. It's a piece that's got to fit just right. And so the image that we're getting here is that Jesus was rejected because he didn't fit the mold. You had an opening, you had an idea, you had a space, and Jesus, to Judaism, did not fit that space. Therefore, he was rejected. But in God's eyes, Jesus was the perfect fit to bring everything together here. But in verse 4, we have an interesting juxtaposition here about Jesus being a living stone. A living stone. This is before we knew anything about a rolling stone. You had a living stone. Thank you. If I can't get a groan on July 3rd, all right. It's an interesting comparison and contrast here with two things that seemingly are very different. Because a stone we think of as not living, I mean the ultimate not living, it's hard as a rock, right? Whereas something that's living has some mobility to it. So, what might the author of 1 Peter be trying to convey to us by calling Jesus a living stone? What do you think? Don't everyone talk all at once.
First of all, as a geologist science, stones kind of live.
Yeah, I thought about that.
All right, we won't go into that, because diastrophism and all that kind of stuff, stones are living. But to your question, I see it as, you think of stone being solid, so Christ is solid, but he is there for us because he's living.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah. So these aren't contradictory things, but both are true. You know, one of our favorite hymns of the church is, "On Christ the solid rock I stand." And yet we also sing of Jesus in a non-stone kind of way. I think there's an interesting comparison to Peter. Remember Peter's name? Petra, which means the rock. And here is either Peter or one of his disciples writing about Jesus being the rock. Pretty interesting stuff, if you think about that as well. Rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And then we move from Jesus being a living stone to us being living stones. Like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house. So the image here is really beautiful because it is of believers, those who follow Christ, being the living stones that make up the house of God. Wow. So this may be a little like Tim Burton creepy. I'm thinking, you know, movie kind of thing here of stones that move around and stuff and have faces.
Didn't that happen in Noah, the movie? Did anybody see Noah, the
Yes.
movie? I heard the rocks
Yes.
like became people and started.
Yes.
I didn't see the movie.
They weren't really people, they were creatures.
Well, there's a reason I didn't see Noah the movie.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I realized it wasn't biblical, but that's what I pictured when you said that. I heard that the rocks like started
Wasted
moving.
money.
Yeah, well, that's the kind of creepy I'm thinking about here with this. So that we become the living stones and into a spiritual house. We tend to, again, think of the church as a building. This is a good reminder to us that the church is people. In this image gives us an idea of people as a type of collection. And this is not just about the local church, like here. This is about the universal church, all who call upon the name of the Lord, being built into a spiritual house. Does anyone know the story of, I just lost the name of the church. There is a historic Methodist church in the Arts District downtown. St. John's? No, what is it? It's right across the street from Booker T. Washington.
St. Paul's?
St. Paul's.
Isn't it? I know which one
It is
I
St.
think
Paul.
it is. I think it's Paul.
It used to be out there all by itself.
Yeah.
And now they've expanded Booker T, coming toward one side, and they built One Arts Plaza right next to it on the other side. But if you're driving, you know, down the service road along Woodall Rogers, if you're going to the Meyerson or the Wiley or any of those places, you'll go right by there. It's a beautiful, historic old building. If you look sometime on the east side of that building, despite the renovation that has happened there on the other three sides of that building, they've left that side the way it originally was. And one of the things you'll notice is the brick does not match anything. the brick on that church is like it came from 100 different places. None of the bricks match. But the reason is the brick, in fact, did come from 100 different places. When they were building that church, and it's a historically black church, and I believe this dates back to the early 20th century when that building was built, around the turn of the 20th century, or a little after. People didn't always have money to give to the building campaign, but they brought bricks. And everyone was encouraged to bring a brick as part of your offering. And from those bricks, they built the church. Now, isn't that a beautiful image of this? And so you might look at that wall in the church and say, well, my gosh, that's ugly. I mean, they're not all the same color. But actually, it's beautiful because they're not all the same color. It, I think, reminds us of what this would look like with all people around the world being part of the body of Christ and being built together into a spiritual house. How about that? Okay, anyone want to comment on that before we move to the next clause?
How did you know that?
How did I know
The
that?
stuff that's in your head.
I am a purveyor of trivia. I'm always looking for little factoids, historical nuts, because they make good columns. So, you know, when you write and speak a lot. Yeah. So we're to be the living stones, built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood. Now, here's the next important thought. Remember that in Judaism, the people were not the priests. The priests were the priests. And you had to be a Levite to be a priest. And only certain people were priests. And you had to go and get the help of a priest. Not only the priest could do certain things. And so one of the big themes of the New Testament is that we, as believers, become priests unto God ourselves. That the veil in the temple was ripped at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, which symbolized to us access to the Holy of Holies for all people. And this is, interestingly enough, one of the great differences historically between Protestants and Catholics, because Catholicism, the Roman Church, still leans back into that Jewish idea of priests being a separate class. And in our Baptist tradition in particular, we talk about the priesthood of all believers. Now, the interesting thing to remember about that is that should always be spoken of in the plural, not in the singular, because they mean different things. If you say the priesthood of the believer, singular, that means that you can just up and do whatever you jolly well please yourself without any accountability to anyone else. But when we talk about the priesthood of all believers, we talk about the community of faith and how we have discernment together, that it takes all of us built together into this spiritual house to be the kind of priests to God. Does that make sense? Any of you old Baptists understand that distinction? I'm an old Baptist. Yeah. You lifelongers like me? Yeah. And to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So what would that be? So in the Jewish temple, you offer animal sacrifices, blood sacrifices, and there are other types of sacrifices that are called for in the Old Testament. But if we, as spiritual priests before God, are offering sacrifices today, what would that be? What is it that we bring to sacrifice?
Money.
Money. Always a good answer. Thank you.
Well, in the Old Testament, it says, you know, that he wants the contrite heart and not, you know, the traditional sacrifices.
Yeah.
But a willing and contrite heart.
And I think that's certainly one. There's another, is it a psalm that talks about the sacrifice of praise? And there's that Donnie Rambo song, yeah. Yeah. Indeed. What else might we bring as a sacrifice?
Choices.
Okay, say more. What
Well,
kind of choices?
Whether we are acknowledging him and reflecting him in what we do,
Yes.
rather than going the opposite direction.
I would think any of our gifts or, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Any of our gifts or abilities, I mean, or talents or anything he's given us, if we sacrifice it to him, it's a way of just emptying ourselves of how we would want to use that and truly using it on his behalf. I mean, and not deciding how, I think this would be good for God, but truly sacrificing it and laying it, to say, how do you want me to use it, or.
So before we get off that point, and then go to Norma and then to Pat, I like this idea because one of the things you're saying is, think of if you're going to go buy a wedding present for someone, for example. You may have a certain object in mind, and you may go hunt for just the right vase or a bowl or serving piece or candlestick or frame or whatever. And you may, if you dearly love this couple, you may sacrifice to buy this perfect gift that you go find a specific thing. And what I like about what Kristen is saying is the sacrifice that we give to God is not just that, but it's the stuff that we may deem less important as well. There's a more holistic approach to that. We can get caught up in thinking, well, I can only give my best thing to God, and I'm not there yet. But sometimes, and a lot of times, we just need to give ourselves to God as we are. Norman?
I think that the Old Testament is basically a history of the Jews. And in the beginning, I guess you would say, they would dedicate or sacrifice their firstborn son. Well, males are very important back in those days. And I'm not saying slaughter, but dedicate them to
Right.
God. And then we switched over to animals, which also became a symbol of wealth. And so that's when they switched to giving money. And it's, as far as I'm concerned, maybe shows the decline of our faith in God. Because we, shall we say, watered down the tithes.
I would say that there's even a greater challenge to us today than money, and I'm not going to deny that that's an issue, and that's time.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that people are least willing to sacrifice today is time. Time to come to church, time to worship, time to study, time. Pat?
I heard a good message this morning before I came here about drifting. And they use an example on a river or something. If you sit in a canoe, you're drifting along and you just see all the pretty things and you're taking them in, God's like, but then after a while the current gets faster, you go faster, 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 and the less you can see, the less you can appreciate. And I see this as kind of a metaphor about what everybody here is saying in terms of we sacrifice, the drifting to us is we sacrifice these things out here to stay on the path, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay. Yes.
What do we do about Lent? Some people give something up for 40
Okay.
days.
So that's a sacrifice, right? And the idea behind that is an ancient Christian discipline to force yourself to be mindful. So there are other variations on this. One of the most extreme that you would find in certain parts of very observant Catholicism is, I forget the name of this. What is the thing that like pokes you? That you either wear it on a belt or a bracelet so that it's perpetually sticking into your skin. There's a name for that. It's in the Da Vinci Code too. Yeah. The idea, whether it be that or giving up something or any variation on that, is to create some awareness so that you're reminded on a regular. Some people wear prayer bracelets, or I know some people who have put a dot on their watch, like a face watch. You can't do this on a digital watch. They put a dot at a certain number on there, which reminds them every time they see the clock come to that dot to stop and pray. So it's a form of spiritual discipline.
Do we teach our children that? Because as this old Baptist, we never did it.
No, so yeah, our kids today would get exposed to those types of spiritual disciplines.
In Sunday school?
In Sunday school, certainly in the youth group, they talk a lot about that kind of stuff.
But they don't give up things from,
a lot of them do, but not as extreme. I would say, not as extreme as you can only eat fish on
Catholics
Fridays.
are big on that. Chocolate.
Right.
They make such a big deal about it.
Yeah, and we have a lot of folks here who would do that in different ways. And the other variation that I like is a Lenten observance, not of giving something up, but taking something on. So rather than saying what you're not going to do, think of something you are going to do that's going to be positive. And that also can serve the same purpose. And I think, back to Pat's comment, all of these are things to help us not drift. Because if we're just sitting in the faith boat and rocking down the river and not paying attention, it's very easy to just run ashore and not even know we run ashore, or to be out in the middle of the ocean. Right? Yeah. Anyone else on that? Okay. Verse 6, for it stands in Scripture, and this obviously is a reference. In this next section, we talked about early on when we began studying 1 Peter how 1 Peter draws a lot of inspiration from the Old Testament. And so, would someone look up for me, please, and be ready to read for us in just a moment, Isaiah 28:16. Would someone raise your hand and do that? You got it? Isaiah 28:16. See, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone chosen and precious. And Zion, of course, is the heavenly realm, or the promised land, or the place of God's dwelling. Zion is a common word for that. Like we might talk about heaven, Zion is a destination idea. Okay, you got it?
So this is what the sovereign Lord says. See, I lay a stone in Zion, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation. The one who relies on it will never be stricken with panic.
So you see the parallel? And there are other places in the Old Testament and in the New Testament where we have similar language that gets picked up here. Paul also talks about a cornerstone in his writings. And it all sort of comes together here to, again, paint this picture of building a house or a building that Jesus is the cornerstone that holds it all together. And this is a precious, perfect stone. And whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. Which is a way of saying, if you're part of this spiritual house around Jesus as the cornerstone, it's going to hold up. It's not going to come tumbling down. To you who believe, he, being Jesus, is precious. But for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the very head of the corner. And there's another reference here, if I can get it to pop up in my notes. Would someone read for us Matthew 21:42? Matthew 21:42. Who's got it? Amy's looking for it. Matthew 21:42. And this Matthew passage actually quotes the Psalms. So this is like a double deep quote here.
Okay, ready?
Yep.
Jesus said to them, have you never read in the scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the capstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes.
So here's the very words of Jesus, and now in 1 Peter they're being quoted back to make this point. So interesting thread that you can pull all the way from Isaiah through the Gospels into the epistles here, that the stone that looked like it didn't fit is actually the one that you need. If you've ever worked a jigsaw puzzle, you understand how this works too. Allison and I were working on a jigsaw puzzle last night, and there was a piece that you thought that piece is nowhere on this table.
But it is.
But in fact it was. and we'd been staring straight at it, but had missed it. And so, again, not to belabor a point, but this is mainly talking about how the expectations within Judaism had been set up in such a way that what they were looking for was not what they needed. And the piece they actually needed was before them and was not recognized. So the contrast here is those who believe and find this stone to be precious, and those who don't and reject the very same stone. And there's an interesting turn of phrase in verse 8, because it says, this is a stone that makes them stumble and a rock that makes them fall. And there are two different words in the Greek here. The word translated stumble and the word translated fall. One is something that maybe you put in your own way and you know it's there. The other is something you accidentally trip on because you don't see it. And so there's a staging of degree here between those two things. Now, I think the hardest part of this is the bottom of verse 8. They stumble because they disobey the word as they were destined to do. Now, if you're a Calvinist and believe that everything is predestined by God, you're going to love this verse. If you're me, not so much. You're going to struggle with what this means. They stumble because they disobey the word as they were destined to do. The way I would explain that is to say that if you boil water and pour it on your head, you are destined to have a burn. It is the way it works. If you stick a fork in a light socket, you are destined to get a shock. Right? There are things that are going to, natural law of...
You leave your phone on.
Good Lord.
Hey, Dan.
Well, that goes long.
Yeah. Does that make sense? And what would you say about that or add to that? How do you read this? About stumbling because they disobey the word as they were destined to do.
Well, that helps a lot, because I don't like that at all. No. It's a good, very good, very good. Way to get out of that. Yeah.
Now, the other thing I would point out about this is we love to pick verses like this about others who disobey the word and stumble, while paying little attention to ourselves as we disobey and stumble. If we disobey, it's just it's a flesh wound. It's a less significant. But if you stumble, you must have grievous sin in your life. Donna?
The word here, are we still talking about the Hebrew scriptures?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well,
Not, or is it talking about the Hebrew scriptures and what is being preached?
I think the word, sorry, now I understand your question. When the word
Yeah.
is referring to the message of the gospel.
Of the gospel.
Yeah, I think it is the
Okay.
word here is the teaching more than the Bible.
Okay.
So it would include the Bible, but also the message of Jesus. Because remember, we said last week, there is no New Testament when this is written.
Right.
Right?
All right, if we're gonna stumble on something, I mean, many times we put things in front of us, but then why do we fall on something that we don't see? And it's usually because we're paying attention to something else.
I like that, yeah. Well, it's just, we're back to the drift here. You're in the canoe floating down the river, and you're paying
I
attention to a
think
bird in
of
the
poor
tree.
Susan Leonard, who is at home with a broken kneecap.
That's our
because she
second one
fell-
in this class.
Yes,
Because she fell over, you know, the thing in a parking lot, the half moon, because she was thinking about her 4 grandchildren and getting them into the world. And that just to me was a picture of, you have so many other things going that you don't see what's in front of you.
well, and I say that the physical fall, I don't know how many times I see this, where someone falls, and it typically is because they just weren't paying attention. And we've all done that, right? We've all, I mean, you walk through the house in the dark, and you forget that there's a box that you set down there.
Or the coffee table's been there forever. Still can't get out.
But going back to the destined thing, is it that, I mean, obviously if we fall, we're destined to get hurt, but are we destined to fall? I
Yeah,
mean, that's where the big issue
That's
lies.
the debate,
It's like
isn't it?
here, are they
Yeah.
destined to disobey, or if you disobey, you're destined to fall?
That's the point.
I know, but I'm just like, I'm
Yeah.
curious what.
so I personally want to lean on the side they're destined to hurt themselves more than they're destined to sin. Although you could say, to that point, that because of the human condition, we are all destined to sin.
Right, but then it goes back to where we initially created without that option that they could have actually lived Adam and Eve happily ever after perfectly, or were they even destined?
Yeah, that lasted a few seconds.
Yeah, I know, so, but it goes back to then why God creates such a knowing, I mean.
Yeah, that gets into that whole thing. David, help us out here.
Yeah.
Keep in mind that destinies can change, and that's what Jesus came, was to change all of our destinies. So I think this applies to all of us
Interesting.
equally.
I like that too. Destinies can change. I think that's true. Wow. There's a lot of gospel in that, David.
You need to turn the camera on.
Yeah. Make sure everyone out there knows who said that. That was from the cameraman, guys. All right, verse 9, but you, speaking to us, are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. As they say, that will preach. That's, that is a marvelous reminder to us. So look in verse 9 at the 4 ways the same thing is said. You're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. 4 ideas here, all saying essentially the same thing in a different way. And the idea is a very important one in Christianity and in understanding the New Testament. And that is that the church, the body of Christians, becomes the new Israel. Now, this is this is not the first thing you want to say when you're beginning your Jewish-Christian dialogue session. Do not start there, because that's very off-putting. On the other hand, there is within American Christianity another view that's equally wrong. And that is that America is God's chosen nation. Not in the Bible anywhere. Just for the record, not in here.
It hasn't been discovered yet.
The teaching is that the church, the Christians, those who follow Christ assume that new priesthood, that new following the promises of God. And there's no envisioning of another nation a geopolitical state, picking that up and carrying that mantle once it moves from Israel. So there's two ditches you can get in on this that are important for us to remember on this Independence Day weekend. One is American exceptionalism, which is this idea that God has blessed America above all other nations, and therefore we are special in God's eyes. That's very dangerous, in my view. And it's also not biblical. The other is to continue to give to Israel the special privilege that they had in the Old Testament days, as if that is a political answer to a spiritual problem. Now, we could get into arguments for the rest of this day about these two ideas if we wanted to, but I think that all sort of collides here in this as one example of this. The positive note out of these verses is in verse 10. We were just a collection of loose stones, and God has built us into a spiritual house. We are God's people. Once we did not know the mercy of God, but now we have received mercy. This whole thing reminds me of the man who Jesus healed in the Gospels. And Jesus' critics were trying to get him to testify against Jesus for healing on the Sabbath, which was against the law, the Jewish law. And the man took a very diplomatic answer. He said, all I know is once I was blind, but now I can see. And that's what I think verse 10 says for us as well. Once we were blind, now we can see. Once we were not a people, now we are a people. Once we had not received mercy, now we have received mercy. When we get next week into verse 11, we're going to begin to talk more about what we do with the mercy that we have received. Thoughts, last thoughts from today's lesson? Any loose ends that we've left there before we get to prayer concerns? Anyone have a deep thought?
Well, I just like, when we read that, I went back and read chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, who this letter was written to, who those people were, and I think, wow, the people hearing it in that day found great hope in this, because they were in exile, they were out there, they were, nobodies.
That's right. And now they are somebody.
Yeah.
There's the sermon in it. Okay, well, as we pray today, we certainly do want to continue to remember Kristen and your family and your loss, and there's so much that goes along with that for so long.